Do you want to know who are the most evil serial killers ever? If so, you're not alone. Our society seems to have both a repulsion and fascination with serial killers' stories. Just look at all the serial killers movies and serial killers documentary out there. But who are these serial killers, and what motivates them to take the life of another human being? We really don't know. What we do know is that as humans, we are capable of gruesome things. Take these torture devices for example. What sort of mind comes up with such terrible devices for the specific reason of torture? Serial killers in disguise maybe. Who knows? These are 10 of the most evil serial killers in recent history. 1. David Berkowitz. A serial killer known as the Son of Sam or the .44 caliber killer, David Berkowitz carried out a series of shootings in the summer of 1976. Using a .44 caliber bulldog revolver, he shot 6 people dead and wounded 7 others. Berkowitz sent a series of taunting letters to police and the press promising further shootings, terrorizing the people of New York City. Eventually captured in August 1977, Berkowitz confessed to all of the killings and was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison for each murder. It is unlikely that Berkowitz will ever be released. 2. Edmund Kemper. Known as the Co-Ed Killer, Edmund Kemper is an American serial killer and necrophile who carried out a series of brutal murders in California in the 1970s. He murdered his grandparents when he was 15 years old, then later killed and dismembered 6 female hitchhikers in the Santa Cruz area. He then murdered his mother and one of her friends before turning himself into the police days later. He was found guilty in November 1973 of 8 counts of murder. He asked for the death penalty, but instead received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. 3. Larry Bittaker and Roy Norris. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, nicknamed the Toolbox Killers, are 2 American serial killers who together murdered 5 young women in California in 1979. Bittaker and Norris lured victims into their van and drove them to secluded areas where they both raped and tortured them horrifically before murdering them. In 1981, Bittaker and Norris were charged with murder, kidnapping and rape. Bittaker was sentenced to death and remains on death row to this day. Update: Norris was spared execution in return for his testimony against Bittaker and sentenced to 35 years in prison. 4. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley killed 5 children between 1963 and 1965 in Greater Manchester, England. The victims were between 10 and 17 years old and were sexually assaulted before being brutally murdered. 3 of the victims were discovered in graves dug on Saddleworth Moor, and the last victim's body was found at Brady's house. The whereabouts of the 4th victim, Keith Bennett, remains unknown. Both Brady and Hindley were later sentenced to life imprisonment. Hindley died in prison in 2002, while Brady has since been confined in the maximum security Ashworth Hospital. 5. Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono, the Hillside Stranglers. Between late 1977 to early 1978, cousins Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono carried out a reign of terror in California. The cousins kidnapped, raped and killed 10 girls between the ages of 12 and 28, strangling each victim in the hills above Los Angeles. The cousins' method of killing led to them being known as the Hillside Stranglers. Bianchi attempted to plead not guilty by way of insanity, but was found to be faking mental illness, so instead agreed to plead guilty and testify against Buono. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment. Buono died of a heart attack in his cell in 2002. 6. Dennis Rader, the BTK Killer. Dennis Rader murdered 10 people in Sedgwick County, Wichita, Kansas between 1974 and 1991. Obsessed with notoriety, Rader sent taunting letters to police under the name BTK, which stood for bind, torture, kill. Rader stalked his victims before breaking into their homes, then bound their limbs before strangling them. Having disappeared in 1988, BTK re-emerged in 2005 when he sent a floppy disk to the press. This was to be his downfall. Tracing him via the floppy disk, Rader was arrested and charged, upon which he immediately confessed. He is serving 10 consecutive life sentences with an earliest possible release date of February 26, 2180. 7. Donald Henry Gaskins. In 1969, Gaskins began killing a series of hitchhikers he picked up while driving around the coastal highways of the American South, torturing and mutilating his victims. He claimed to have killed 80 to 90 people. He was arrested in 1975, when a criminal associate confessed to police that he had witnessed Gaskins killing 2 young men. He was convicted of 8 murders and was sentenced to death, which was later commuted to life imprisonment without parole. Remarkably, Gaskins went on to commit another murder within the high-security prison, killing a fellow inmate. He is the only man to have ever killed an inmate on death row. 8. Peter Manuel. An American-born Scottish serial killer known to have killed 9 people across southern Scotland between 1956 and 1958, Manuel is suspected of having killed as many as 18 people. Police were unable to prove his guilt until his final murders, when some banknotes Manuel had been using to pay for drinks in Glasgow pubs were proven to be stolen from one of his victims. He confessed to these murders after his mother confronted him at the police station where he was being held. Manuel was hanged at Glasgow's Barlinnie prison for his crimes in July 1958. He was one of the last prisoners to be hanged in Scotland before they ended capital punishment. 9. John George Hay. Known as the acid bath murderer, John George Hay was an English serial killer during the 1940s. He was convicted of the murders of 6 people, although he claimed to have killed 9. A professional conman, he targeted wealthy individuals and charmed them into believing he was a successful businessman. He lured his victims to a derelict warehouse before shooting them. He then dissolved their bodies in sulfuric acid before forging papers in order to sell their possessions and collect their life savings. In spite of the absence of the victims' bodies, there was sufficient forensic evidence to convict Hay of murder. In 1949 he was sentenced to death and hanged at Wandsworth Prison. 10. Fred Rose West. Between 1967 and 1987, Fred West and his wife Rose tortured, raped and murdered at least 11 young women and girls. The pair were finally apprehended and charged in 1994 after police obtained a search warrant and located several human bones buried within the garden and under the floorboards of their home. During his trial, Fred West hanged himself prior to being convicted. In 1995, Rose West was jailed for life, having been found guilty on 10 counts of murder.